This is a recording of a presentation made at the System Dynamics Conference in the summer of 2011 that I'd like to share with you about the role of system dynamics in individualized biophysical medicine. We're going to be talking about a project we did with a dialysis care facility and to illustrate how these techniques could be used for individualized medicine. There are three messages here. The management of anemia is a critical issue for 90% of dialysis patients. System dynamics modeling helped redefine and solve this problem. The redefinition was the important part. And then system dynamics modeling provides tools for learning in the emerging world of individualized medicine. And as reviewing this slide, I realize it's missing a fourth key message. And that message should actually be presented first. No matter what numbers we talk about, what processes we talk about, what metrics or what cost savings we talk about, the important thing is we're talking about individualized dialysis patients who are going through a brutal care regime, a very difficult lifestyle, and anything that can be done to improve the quality of life for these patients is of the utmost importance. Chronic kidney disease, hemodialysis, and anemia, just some background and context. By chronic kidney disease, we mean anything that leads to a permanent loss of kidney function. Their kidneys are not going to get better. End-stage renal disease is a marker as to when near or complete failure of the kidneys to function normally occurs. And as we shall see, kidneys do more than filter wastes out of the body. Kidneys play a critical role in the management and the creation of red blood cells, which deliver oxygen to the body. And we'll be talking about that, how that works. One treatment option for end-stage renal disease patients is hemodialysis, where a patient might go for 4 to 5 hour sessions per week to be hooked up to a machine, have their blood move through an external machine, the impurities removed. Now, 90% of hemodialysis patients require erythropoietic stimulating agents, and we'll call them ESAs, and I'll be using that term through here, ESAs, to prevent and control the anemia of chronic kidney disease. That 90% is 90% of a huge number. The top line is the prevalence of hemodialysis patients, and the number is near or possibly over 400,000 patients. And in 2011, 2012, more than 120,000 patients will enter that stage, a large fraction of which will be entering into hemodialysis. This is a huge problem. Again, in hindsight, I would prefer to update this slide to say the scratch pad notes are this. This represents the stories of 400,000 individual patients who are going through this kind of treatment and who are dependent upon hemodialysis for their very survival. 406,000 patients in 2011 times the projected $30,000 per patient means that there's a cost of over $12 billion a year doing it. And this is just the United States. Of course, this is a worldwide problem. You just multiply appropriately. Some terms that I'm going to be using. Hemoglobin is a protein that enables the transport of oxygen to the body and carbon dioxide from the body to the lungs. Erythropoiesis is interesting. It comes from the Greek term erythro, meaning red, plus poiesis, making. So this erythropoiesis is the red making, the creation of red blood cells. Erythropoietic stimulating agents, this is a class of drugs that are designed to replace a normally produced hormone in the body called erythropoietin, produced by the kidneys. And when the kidneys aren't working, you'll see that it needs to be replaced artificially with this erythropoietic stimulating agent. And then another term is apoptosis. This is, again, Greek, comes from the falling leaves. It refers to programmed cell death. And what we'll see is the erythropoietic stimulating agents prevent apoptosis of red blood cells, allowing more to survive. With that terminology, let's again just touch briefly on anemia among dialysis patients. Anemia. This is a significant quality of life issue for hemodialysis patients. It leads to the loss of appetite, sleep disturbances, decreased exercise tolerance, inability to concentrate, weakness, malaise, body aches, lightheaded, dizziness, fainting. It's like having the flu all the time, except for maybe the vomiting that accompanies the flu. And just here you are, you're feeling this way, and yet you have to maintain this difficult lifestyle of traveling to and from the dialysis center 3 times per week, getting wired up, answering the nurses' questions, getting scolded for eating things you maybe shouldn't have eaten. A lot to talk about there, but it's worth reflection on beyond the definition of the term anemia, how are these people being affected? ESA and iron replacement therapy can effectively treat anemia, but the current protocols do not address system as cause issues. Now, when I presented this to the System Dynamics Society, that was a key word, system as cause, to them. What it can mean to us outside the System Dynamics Society is no matter what processes we talk about, what metrics, how many patients are in that range or in this range, what is the cost of the drug, all of these things are observed patterns and measurements that are created by the underlying system of erythropoiesis under the influence of erythropoietic stimulating agents. What this project was about is getting to understanding what causes the drug to have the effect that it does have, and can we make the red blood cells that a given patient has, an individual patient have, conform to a target level. This is a chart of about almost 2 years worth of data. On the left-hand side we have the ESA dosing level in microgram. Here we're actually talking about Aranesp as opposed to Epogen. And here we have 0 to 200 micrograms on the left, and on the right-hand axis we have the hemoglobin response. The hemoglobin is in blue and the Aranesp doses are in red. And the 2 black lines are what were, up until about a year ago, the target range for the low and high hemoglobin values. And the idea is to keep a patient within the target range. 2 things to notice about this patient here. First, you see the wide oscillation or variation in hemoglobin levels. A second thing to notice is that the administration of the drug was uneven. When the patient was low, say for example right about here, the dose is increased to raise the patient's hemoglobin level, and it raises. And when the hemoglobin is high, the dose is decreased to drop the hemoglobin level. So you see this oscillation occurring, taking an enormous toll on the patient's body. The other thing to notice is that these clusters of hemoglobin measurements very close together represent almost daily measurements. That's telling us that the patient is hospitalized. We have another sample patient. We have the Aranesp doses following a wild, chase your tail kind of pattern where we're trying to get the patient's hemoglobin level centered. And again, we have these excursions above and below the target range. 2 years worth of data. The purpose of the model we wanted to build, and it's a system dynamics simulation model we wanted to build, was we wanted to find the ESA dosing regimen that could stabilize an individual patient's hemoglobin in the center of the target range. We wanted to find the dosing that would make the hemoglobin values do this. Because when the hemoglobin levels are above the target range, you've got thick blood leading to cardiovascular damage, increased risk of stroke, you've got clotting that's going on. And think about the importance of clotting for a dialysis patient when you're moving their blood through an external device. Too low, you've got anemia. And the variation is, again, taking a toll on the patient's body. When many dialysis care facilities are only taking monthly measurements, sometimes these patterns are imperceptible. The purpose of the model was to find a dosing regimen that could stabilize a patient's hemoglobin in the center of the target range. Let's talk about how erythropoiesis works in a healthy patient. It's really governed by the oxygen level in the blood, that the body is designed to keep that at a balanced level. Now, if something happens to cause an oxygen deficit, let's say the patient moves to a higher elevation, this oxygen deficit tells the healthy kidney to increase the production of erythropoietin, which it does. That finds its way into the marrow, and the action of that hormone, erythropoietin, within the marrow is to decrease the apoptosis, the programmed cell death of the progenitor cells. That leads to an increase in the oxygen in the number of red blood cells, which increases the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, which restores the balance. Now that's how the healthy kidney works. We'll call that a balancing loop, a natural balancing loop. The problem is the kidneys of end-stage renal disease patients do not produce sufficient erythropoietin. Therefore, we need to externally provide ESA therapy. But instead of using the oxygen level of the marker to control, what is used is the hemoglobin, which is an indirect measure of the oxygen carrying content. So the ESA therapy is administered intravenously, and that finds its way to the bone marrow, and it has the synthetic ESA, if you will, has exactly the same effect as the naturally produced hormone. And that is an external balancing loop to try and keep the count of the red blood cells at the right level. The problem is there is a 15 to 20 day delay between the decrease of the progenitor cells and the red blood cells. Now, to the conference folks I was presenting this to, system dynamics people, when they see a delay like that, people characterize systems like this as an oscillation waiting to happen. Outside the system dynamics community, they may or may not associate that delay with a naturally occurring oscillation. What they will notice by just looking at the monthly hemoglobin levels is, man, this is hard to manage. This is a concept map of the model that we built, and what these boxes represent are aggregations or collections of cells at varying stages of development. On the left-hand side of the chart represents the bone marrow, and here we have the circulation. In the bone marrow, we have a couple types of progenitor cells called blast-forming units and colony-forming units. Here we spend some time, 15 to 17 days here in this stock, and we flow out here, and in the marrow we spend 2 to 3 days being produced, and there's a little adhesive components on each of the cell surfaces that in this 2 to day 3 period dissolve, and they become the marrow reticulocytes become released into circulation. And after this point, once the cells are here, because of the nature of the cells, they don't replicate. Cells here are replicating like crazy, but back here they do not replicate, and there's a fixed count of those, and they have a lifespan. And a healthy individual, red blood cell can live 120 days or so. In hemodialysis patients, that red blood cell lifespan is decreased, perhaps down to 60 to 80 days. We give a dose, and it is eliminated, so to speak, from the body with a given half-life. But the level of the ESA influences the CFU survival. As we said before, what happens is when you give the ESA, it decreases what we call this leakage flow of replicating CFUs. It allows them to survive, and they move down the chain. And what that does is ultimately increases the size of the population of circulating red blood cells. Now, there were some parameters for the model that we used to individualize it to the patient. There's a BFU production rate, there's a CFU survival rate, there's the reticulocyte release is governed by some other things, and the lifespan of the patient's red blood cells was also a parameter. Using those parameters and a few others I didn't describe here, we could actually cause this model to predict the ultimate level of our RBCs and therefore control the level of RBCs. Now you look at this thing and you ask, okay, to a system dynamics person at the conference, they're saying, great, this is a nice little calculator, but I don't see any feedback here. Well, the feedback we designed became a very important tool to control the hemoglobin levels of the patients that he was caring for. At the beginning of the project, he was caring for about 50 patients. At the end of the project, he was reviewing the results for over 600 patients. In order to test this model, what we did is we simulated how using the standard protocol would influence hemoglobin levels in the patient. Here we have the same chart. Here's the dose on the left, then the hemoglobin level on the right, the target levels, and this dotted line is the center line of the simulated hemoglobin values. This is the simulated result that would actually be obtained if the protocol were followed. You see the ESA dose varying, and after a delay, here we're increasing the dose, and delay-wise, the dose is going up, and so on. So one pattern we saw was oscillation about some center line. The other pattern we saw was that sometimes the standard protocol could actually stabilize a patient's hemoglobin value. Unfortunately, you couldn't control the level at which the hemoglobin was stabilized. Now here's a revisit back to patient 1 after applying the model-based protocol. Here the patient's hemoglobin levels maintained pretty well within the target range. Here we now have a steady dose. System dynamics, how wonderful it is. I mean, one of the things you come out of it saying, oh gee, if I give a constant dose, then the hemoglobin level should be at a constant level. Patient 2, we have a similar story. Here we have the 2 years of data, and then an additional more than 2 years of data where we were able to keep the patient's hemoglobin level within the target range. One feature to notice about this is the target range changed from 10 to 13 grams per deciliter to 10 to 12. What we were able to do was modify the patient's dosing regimen to steer the patient down into the range that we wanted. The available dosing vial sizes, the vial sizes don't actually or always match exactly what the patient needs. And so we devised methods to mix and match various vial sizes to synthesize the dose that the patient would actually need on a weekly basis. The model works really well. It helps us keep the hemoglobin within the target range. Timeline-wise, we noticed before the second quarter of 2008 oscillations that we knew that we could do something about those oscillations, so we developed and did some pilot studies in the third and fourth quarter. And then we had a software application in place and completed a rollout by the second quarter of 2009. Then we had the hemoglobin target range decrease from 10 to 12 second quarter of 2010, completed a second version of the model in the first quarter of 2011. The second version of the model having more biophysically accurate parameters in it. So what are we saying here? On the second quarter of 2008, in about 3 years, we've gone from, we observe a pattern to controlling the pattern for 650 patients. I show this chart as an artifact of what the project is. We don't have time to walk through all the details of this. It's called a behavior over time chart. What we're displaying here is about 8 quarters worth of data where we're showing a patient's actual hemoglobin values, and here in this light blue line we're showing a simulated hemoglobin value, the value that would be obtained if these actual green doses, these green boxes, were given, and based upon that we use the model to develop a recommended ESA dosing, which is a dosing right here. The green box means this is what we recommend. The green dot means that's what I actually gave. So we see we actually missed a dose here and we gave a little bit higher dose and so on. But for the, by and large, we were able to maintain. Here was an extra dose here. This is a chart that points to the redefinition of the problem that we're talking about. Before this project, the care providers were not looking at data in this way. What they were looking at is what is the current hemoglobin value and possibly what was the previous hemoglobin value. They were not thinking about the underlying system as cause issues that we've talked about that cause hemoglobin values to be what they are. But here they're thinking in those terms. And as you can see, for this patient, we've maintained a pretty steady hemoglobin value. What were the improvements that were made? Patient quality of life and staff productivity, cost reductions, and thinking about biophysical system dynamics in general. Here we have from January 7 to April of 11, the percentage of patients within the 10 to 13 target range. Back in 2007, we were at 68%. The formal intervention and rollout began about here. We had been on the increase by decreasing the number of patients that were really high. Since the intervention began, we've made a steady increase to up to having near 90%, and I believe now over 90% of the patients in the hemoglobin range. And we've decreased the number of patients with high hemoglobins down to 2%. We have had an increase in low hemoglobins. Now I mentioned earlier that the target range was narrowed from 10 to 13 to 10 to 12. When that was done in May of 2010, 54% of the patients were in the target range of 10 to 12. Today, we have better than 73% of the patients in the target range of 10 to 12. Now, I mentioned patients' quality of life has increased. We have fewer patients with high hemoglobin, a few patients with low hemoglobin, but also patients with stable hemoglobin, so that their body is being oxygenated at a constant rate instead of a varying rate, varying month per month, taking its toll on the function of the body. These patients are feeling a lot better. We have lots and lots of stories about patients feeling well. There are anecdotes about how patients are now entering into activities to mix in. Their life isn't just about going to have dialysis and have dialysis done. They can re-enter their life and do some things. One of my favorite stories is about the woman who recovered enough with stable hemoglobin to, instead of go home and be sick for a day and a half, was actually able to leave her session that afternoon and go shopping with her daughter. That's a huge improvement, and that's something that gave us a tremendous amount of gratification in seeing that happen. Here we have the distribution in January 2007 and June 2011 of the percentage of patients within in the target range. And here we have unimodal distribution. It shows that we're getting some sort of control over this, and we're able to move patients into the target range. As I've mentioned a couple times, the new target range has decreased, and we've got our work cut out for us on how to narrow this distribution even further. But we now believe we have the tools in place to allow us to do that. We did not begin this project to ask the question, how do you reduce the cost of care? That is in our mind, because if we're not spending money on unnecessarily, we have more money available for support of the organization, learning of the organization, improvement in the organization, investments in projects like this. So cost reductions to the provider are critical. Okay, especially in the light of the emerging Medicare requirements that are coming out. It's important to them, and it's important to patients too, because, as I say, this leaves more resources available to understand how this is working. What does this chart say? It says that in January 2007, the average ESA cost of patients per month was $700. And at the end, the average ESA cost per month was $400. This green line represents the number of patients that we enrolled in the system over time, roughly speaking. So now we have 650 patients requiring $300 a month less each. That's well over $1 million in better resource allocation the provider can do. We're excited about the possibility that this represents for firms to invest in biophysical system dynamics, not just to save money, but to improve the quality of life for the patients that they're taking care of. Here's another one about improved quality of life. I'm not claiming that we have a causal thing here. We're currently studying this, but we have observed the following. If we measure the discharges per patient year before and after, we've got a 27% reduction that we measured. There were no other significant quality improvement efforts going on at the time. There were no other interventions that we're aware of. There could have been a miraculous healing among the 17 sites that made all these patients suddenly better. But one thing we were doing was we were stabilizing patients' hemoglobins. And in the number of days hospitalized per patient year, a 30% decrease. More is to follow on the causal connection or not between these things. We're very encouraged by this result. And I'm sure the patients that are spending 4 days less per year in the hospital are more excited than we are. This is worth over $3 million a year. Most of these patients are Medicare, and Medicare does not reimburse the full hospitalization cost. The provider bears the difference here. I had the pleasure of seeing this topic presented to the grand round meetings of nephrologists, and the comments from the nephrologists were like, this approach applies to all of medicine. It's not just anemia management and ESA management. Again, this is a direct quote. This approach could revolutionize medical care. Or, from a hematologist, this approach asks exactly the right questions about biophysical systems, about homeostasis, about cause and effect, about delay, And the hematologist went on to say these questions are not being asked in medical schools today. It effectively addresses, this is from a lead nephrologist, effectively addresses the fundamental issue at the core of medical care, the management of homeostasis. And one I get a kick out of sometimes, one nephrologist said, this, if we actually did this, it places us in grave danger of actually learning something. And that's what we're really all about, to see what we can do to understand the structures that cause dynamic behavior that so often are invisible on a day-to-day basis. What we intend to do in the future is to extend the erythropoietic model. We need to do things like add the effect of iron. We need to add the effects of inflammation. We plan to apply this methodology to a methadone dosing learning environment. It's a similar type of problem where delays involved are costing lives of real patients. And if we simply understand how these delays work, we can develop effective protocols. Other areas to which this applies are antibiotics, immunosuppressants that are used for organ transplants. We can possibly save organ transplants. And anticoagulants, warfarin and Coumadin, for example. We can stabilize these. Notoriously, quote, difficult drugs to manage, unquote. But they're difficult to manage because folks do not take a look at the structure that causes the system behavior that they're trying to control. What they do instead is look at the events. There are, across the country and around the world, there are emerging departments of system biology. We're looking at collaboration with them. And for you viewers of the presentation who may not be members of the System Dynamics Society, we have formed a biophysical system dynamics special interest group. This is open to members and non-members of the System Dynamics Society. In the conference in 2013, we hope to be working on various projects in this area, taking a look at how to apply system dynamics to these methodologies. Just a really exciting field, and it's just been one of the most exciting projects. It's been a very meaningful project that I've worked on. One of the most meaningful in my entire career, to be honest with you. It's been extremely rewarding. This is about people. Anemia management is a critical issue for 90% of dialysis patients. System dynamics modeling redefined the problem and then found the solution to that problem. At clinical practice at Mayo Clinic in a short period of time. We didn't need a 10-year study to do this, or debates on going on. There was something we could test, we could validate, and we could implement. And system dynamics very well may be the key to the emerging world of individualized medicine. Thank you for watching, and I hope we can communicate.